Welcome to Stories from the Teacher's Desk. This is where educators connect, share, and grow.
In each episode, we share inspiring stories, practical strategies, and innovative solutions to empower teachers and transform classrooms around the world. You know that feeling when you're trying to follow along with someone speaking English, maybe they've got a different way of talking, or they rephrase things in a way you weren't expecting, and suddenly it hits you. You've missed something important. It's a really common hurdle when you're learning through listening.
It really is. And, the core of the challenge often isn't just about individual words. It's that real-time processing, dealing with those paraphrases and, trying to grasp the bigger picture, the speaker's angle, and drawing your own conclusions as you listen. It really keeps your brain on its toes.
Exactly. So what if there are ways to become a smarter listener? That's where metacognitive strategies come in. It's basically thinking about how you're thinking while you're listening. And that's precisely what we're diving into today. We've got a fascinating look at a research lesson study that happened at Nazarbayev Intellectual Schools in Kazakhstan.
And what makes this study particularly insightful is a specific issue it tackled. They had intermediate English language learners who weren't performing as well as expected on external exams when it came to listening.
Right.
And the key insight here is that while they were okay with basic information, they struggled more with the, let's say, deeper aspects of listening, picking out specific details, understanding the speaker's viewpoint, and those all-important conclusions.
Right. So our mission today is to break down this study and see what they did and what they discovered. We want to explain concisely how teaching these metacognitive strategies, things like trying to guess what you'll hear, really focusing as you listen, and then checking what you've understood afterwards actually made a difference to these students' listening skills.
And it wasn't just the English teachers involved, This study was a real team effort. English, Kazakh, and Russian language teachers, along with a geography teacher, all participated as observers.
Wow.
The shared concern really highlights just how vital good listening skills are across all sorts of subjects.
But get this, and this is where it gets really interesting. The study actually found a significant improvement in the students' listening comprehension after they started using these strategies. But even more revealing is that different levels of learners seem to benefit in quite specific ways. We're definitely going to dig into those details.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so let's unpack the initial problem a little more.
Well, as we were saying, strong listening comprehension demands a lot. Unlike reading, where you can pause and go back, listening is happening live. And when you factor in different accents or when people say the same thing in different ways, that paraphrasing you mentioned, it really forces your brain to work hard in real time to decode and make sense of it all. You know that feeling when someone is speaking quickly, maybe with an accent, and you find yourself struggling to keep up?
Absolutely, and this struggle was clear in the students' scores on those external exams. They were doing pretty well, around 75% on average when it came to understanding the main ideas and specific facts. But here's a key insight. Their scores dropped noticeably to about 56% in those areas requiring deeper processing, like finding detailed information, grasping the speaker's perspective, and drawing conclusions.
Ah, okay.
That's a significant difference, highlighting the specific listening challenges they faced.
Right. And what's fascinating here is that the study also looked at what the students themselves said, and it painted a picture of learners who weren't really actively involved in the listening process. Some admitted they forgot to try and predict what they might hear, they weren't taking good notes, and they'd gotten used to their teachers kind of guiding them every step of the way.
Like spoon-feeding almost.
Yeah, it suggests a more passive approach to listening, where they weren't really equipped with the tools to take charge of their own understanding.
It sounds like they needed to develop more control over their own listening comprehension. So what was the solution? How did they try to help these students become more proactive listeners?
The key was explicitly teaching metacognitive strategies for listening. Think of it as breaking down the act of listening into clear stages and giving students mental tools for each stage. Planning before you listen, keeping track of your understanding while you listen, and then checking what you've learned afterwards.
Okay, so it's not just about hearing the words, it's about being more aware of your own listening process. How did they actually teach this in the classroom? What did these research lessons involve?
They designed 3 lessons, and each one focused on different ways to use these metacognitive strategies. The first lesson was really an introduction to the whole idea. They started by introducing the Metacognitive Awareness Listening Questionnaire, or MALQ.
MALQ, okay.
Yeah, this questionnaire asks students about things like how often they predict, what they will hear, or how much they focus on understanding every single word. It helps them become more aware of their current listening habits.
Right, self-awareness.
Exactly. They also directly taught different types of questions that students often encounter, like filling in forms, true, false, not given, and completing tables. And a big part of this lesson was getting students to guess possible answers before they started listening and to jot down notes while they listened to focus on key details.
So getting them to actively engage before they even heard anything and giving them a way to track information during the listening. What about the second lesson?
The second lesson focused on the skill of trying to anticipate information they might have missed. They worked with question types, like labeling parts of a diagram, matching information, and more table completion exercises.
Oh, okay.
Before listening, they included vocabulary exercises, especially focusing on words that describe location-spatial words to help with the labeling tasks.
Ah, practical.
Very. And importantly, they kept encouraging students to use clues from the context to figure out unknown words, and to use the MALQ again to reflect on their listening after the activity.
It sounds like they were building on the first lesson, focusing on specific listening skills while still emphasizing that metacognitive reflection. And the third lesson.
The final lesson zeroed in on practicing multiple choice questions. Here, the goal was to help students develop their own individual ways of tackling this specific type of question.
Which can be tricky.
Definitely. They encouraged students to look out for synonyms, words that were stressed or emphasized in the recording, and sentences that said the same thing but in different words paraphrased lines. They also reminded them how important it was to take notes and highlight keywords as they worked through the questions. Those types of questions really test your ability to distinguish between what's explicitly stated and what's merely implied or, not mentioned at all.
It's interesting how they focused on different question formats. It makes sense, as different question types probably require slightly different ways of listening, right?
Exactly. And you mentioned the MLEQ was adapted. Yes, to make sure every student could fully understand and use the questionnaire. They translated it into both Kazakh and Russian, which were the languages some of the students used for their other subjects.
Oh, that's smart.
Yeah, a thoughtful step. It likely made it easier for the lower proficiency learners to really think about their own listening processes.
So they introduced the idea, focused on predicting and identifying missed info, and then tackled multiple choice questions, all while getting students to think about their own listening. Now, to really see how this worked for individual students, the study looked at some case studies, right?
That's right. They chose 3 students, let's call them Student A, Student B, and Student C, who represented different levels of English ability. Student A was at a B1 plus level, so one of the stronger students.
Okay.
Student B was at a B1 level, representing the mid-range learners.
Got it.
And Student C was at an A2-B1 level, indicating lower proficiency. By looking closely at these 3 students, the researchers could get a clearer picture of how the teaching strategies were affecting different learners. So we've looked at what the intervention was. Now, to really understand how it played out in practice, let's dig into those individual students.
Okay, let's look at those case studies. What did they see with student A, the high achiever, across those 3 lessons?
Right. With student A, they noticed he quickly started using techniques like underlining important words and trying to predict what he would hear. He also used note-taking pretty effectively when it helped him. Interestingly, when he gave feedback after the first lesson, he said something like, once he understood what he was supposed to do, everything fell into exact place. He also realized how important it was to pay attention to words that were emphasized, especially in multiple-choice questions.
Ah, the stressed words.
Exactly. There was one time he initially got a true, false, not given question wrong, which just shows that even strong learners can benefit from being more aware of how they listen. The key insight with student A, I think, is that even strong learners can significantly refine their existing skills through conscious strategy application.
So even for a student who was already doing pretty well, there was an improvement in how they approached listening and a better understanding of effective techniques. What about student B, the mid-level learner?
Student B's experience was quite interesting. At first, they observed her mentally translating subject-specific words as she listened.
Oh, like word for word.
Yeah, which sometimes caused her to miss what came next. She also found it tricky dealing with numbers. However, as the lessons went on, she showed real progress. She started carefully reading the questions before listening, which helped her focus on what to listen for.
That makes sense.
She also developed ways to approach labeling and table completion tasks. And she specifically mentioned finding keyword underlining to be helpful. Her feedback showed she was becoming more aware of how to tackle different types of listening tasks.
So it sounds like she was moving from a more reactive approach, like translating on the fly, to a more proactive and strategic way of engaging with the listening material.
Precisely.
And finally, student C, the lower achiever. How did they fare?
Well, student C faced more difficulties initially. She struggled to tell the difference between false and not given, made some spelling mistakes, and, at times felt like giving up when she found the listening hard. Understandable.
Yeah.
However, having the MALQ in Kazakh seemed to make a real difference, as it was easier for her to understand and engage with. Over the lessons, they saw a gradual improvement in how she planned and monitored her listening. She also started to see why having her own strategies was important.
So some progress there, too.
Definitely. While she still needed more support, there was a clear increase in her willingness to learn and a growing understanding of how to approach listening tasks.
It's really encouraging to hear that even the student who was struggling the most showed progress and gained some confidence. So what were the main overall findings of this study after they taught these metacognitive strategies? Now we get to the core of our mission. Did these metacognitive strategies actually work?
Yes, they did. The results after the lessons clearly showed that listening comprehension scores improved across all levels of ability. Interestingly, though, the students who were already doing well, the high achievers, made the biggest gains.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Yeah, it suggests that these strategies really help strong learners to further develop and refine their skills.
Does this study offer any insights into why that might be the case? Were the strategies perhaps more readily applicable, or did it unlock a different level of understanding for them?
Well, the researchers suggested that these high-achieving students were better able to use the strategies for processing more complex information and, crucially, to understand paraphrased language by figuring things out on their own and making educated guesses, inferences based on what they heard.
That makes sense. If they already have a good foundation, being more strategic can help them tackle those more complex aspects of listening, like inference and paraphrase. What about the mid-level and lower-level learners? How did they benefit specifically?
The mid-level students showed a noticeable improvement in tasks that involved paraphrased content and understanding spatial relationships, although, interestingly, they still found labeling maps quite challenging.
Okay. Maps can be tricky.
They can. For the lower-achieving students, the improvements were more gradual but still significant. They showed more confidence, understood keywords better, and were more willing to learn, largely thanks to the support they got from their classmates' peer support and the guidance from their teachers. However, they still found more complex vocabulary, paraphrasing, and different accents difficult. It really highlights that one size doesn't necessarily fit all, but these strategies offer pathways for improvement for everyone, just maybe at different paces.
Absolutely. And one of the really significant outcomes you touched on was the positive effect on the students' confidence, right? Especially for those who had previously doubted their ability to understand.
Yeah, definitely. This connects with Bandura's idea of self-efficacy, believing in your own ability to succeed. Feeling more in control of their listening process really seemed to boost their confidence.
That's huge.
It is. It reminds me of when I was learning a new language and finally cracked a difficult listening task. That feeling of accomplishment is a huge motivator.
Totally. And it wasn't just their English listening skills that were affected, was it? You mentioned something about other subjects.
No, and this is another really key finding. Teachers in other subjects, geography, Kazakh, and Russian language, also noticed that students seem to be using these listening strategies in their classes as well.
Oh, wow, a transfer effect.
Exactly. Because listening is such a fundamental skill, students were apparently applying these techniques when they were listening to audio and video in their other subjects. They're becoming more strategic listeners overall.
That's fantastic. It shows the broader impact of teaching these transferable learning skills, not just subject-specific content. So what was the ultimate takeaway from the teacher's perspective? What did they emphasize as the most important thing they learned?
They really emphasized that understanding how to learn the process of actively listening and managing your own learning was ultimately more important than just the number of correct answers students got.
Process over product in a way.
Exactly. It was about empowering students to become more independent, self-regulated learners.
And they even compared what they initially predicted would happen with what actually happened after the study.
Yes, they did. Initially, based on past experience, they thought only maybe 6 to 8 students would reach the learning goals if they had continued teaching as they always had. But after the lesson study intervention, that number actually went up slightly to 8 students achieving the goals, but significantly Another 17 exceeded the learning goals.
Wow.
And the number of students who were still struggling and needed extra help went down from over 5 to just 3. These numbers really highlight the positive impact of explicitly teaching those metacognitive strategies.
Wow, those are some pretty compelling numbers. It really underscores the effectiveness of this approach. So, to wrap things up, what's the main takeaway from this deep dive into this research?
Well, I think the core takeaway is this. Directly teaching students how to plan, monitor, and evaluate their listening, those metacognitive strategies can significantly improve how well intermediate learners understand spoken English. And maybe more importantly, it helps them become more self-directed in their learning.
Yeah, it doesn't just improve test scores. It gives students valuable skills that can help them in all sorts of learning situations beyond just English class.
Exactly. And as we've seen, it helps a wide range of learners, offering ways for students at all levels to get better, even if the gains look different for each group.
Right. The study also had some suggestions for what to do next, didn't it? Recommendations for future practice.
It did. Based on what they learned, they suggested using more challenging listening tasks, ones that require more complex thinking and maybe better understanding of spatial relationships. They also recommended encouraging students to do their own research sometimes to build background knowledge before listening activities.
Activating prior knowledge.
Precisely. And giving more focused practice with synonyms and paraphrased language, using visual aids to help with understanding spatial information in tasks like map labeling.
Makes sense. Address the tricky map issue.
They also suggested maybe using listening tasks with built-in pauses to give students time to process, as well as specific vocabulary and accent training. Lots of practical ideas.
It sounds like they're really using what they learn to make their teaching even better going forward. And the teachers themselves have plans to continue this work.
Yes, they mentioned planning to repeat the study with larger samples and perhaps in different age groups to see if they get the same results, to check the generalizability.
Good idea.
They also intend to publish their findings, share them with other teachers, which could be really helpful for anyone facing similar challenges with listening comprehension.
Absolutely. Sharing these findings could help other educators tackle similar issues. So for you, the listener, as you think about this deep dive, here's a final thought. How often do you consciously think about how you're learning something new, whether it's a language or really anything else?
Good question.
Could being more aware of your own learning process, trying to anticipate difficulties, checking your understanding as you go, and reflecting on what worked well afterwards, could that be the key to understanding things more deeply and maybe reaching your learning goals more effectively? It's definitely something to think about, that idea of thinking about thinking.
Thanks for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend and stay tuned for the next one.